Hi everyone, happy holidays. It's the end of 2021.
It's Angie and Ben here with Kind Heart Homestead, and we wanted to take a few minutes to talk about some of the problems we faced on our homestead throughout the year. So I hope you'll take some of these problems to heart when you're starting your own homestead. Maybe you can avoid some of the hassles we've had, but this is our first time around. We're going to try to stick to our outline here and talk about some of our problems. So let's jump right into that.
So first we were going to talk about crops. We planted a lot of varieties of tomatoes and peppers. It was pretty ambitious for us. Ben built a huge trellis for the tomatoes to crawl up. But one problem we had was that we used biodegradable natural string.
Right, and then through the heat of the summer and with the weight of some of those huge tomatoes we had, and you can look back at a previous video to see it really destroyed those strings, and I had spent hours and hours kind of training the vines to go up these strings with all these little tomato clips, and then once the string broke, it was a huge hassle to kind of replace it, take all those clips off, and try to get the whole weight of the plant back up onto another string.
Also with the tomatoes, we had weeds overgrowing it. We just had them up to our knees and hips at some points. We just need to mulch heavier and keep up with those weeds.
Yeah, actually, we didn't even use a mulch this year. We basically had a full 3 feet between walkways, and we had all sorts of different types of tomatoes. We had some where the fruits were near the ground. We had some where they were way up at the top. But kind of the weeds prevent you from walking up and harvesting, and sometimes you can't even tell when the tomatoes are ripe. They'll just fall on the ground because they're surrounded by weeds, and then the animals will get to them.
Yeah, birds were getting to them a lot. Then we also grew a lot of peppers. I think like 9 or 10 varieties of peppers. That was really fun.
Yeah, and our garden, unfortunately, we picked a spot that kind of slopes down from the driveway into our field. And the bigger our garden gets, the more we're starting to realize that the water settles at one end of the garden. So we do try to stick to some crop rotation rules, and the side effect is some crop has to be in the wet part of the garden. And we've tried different things, and this year half of our peppers kind of ended up in the watery area, and they didn't really like that too much.
Yeah, the peppers on higher ground thrived, and the ones in the lowland, wetter area really suffered.
Yeah, we still got a lot of peppers in the wet area, but one thing I noticed is the roots weren't very strong. The plants would fall over. They'd get really top heavy and fall over, so I'd have to shove some sticks in the ground to try to hold up those plants.
And then we also planted some eggplants. Not a lot, probably only 6 plants, but we didn't eat any of them. I just don't really have a taste for eggplant these days, and neither does Ben.
And these were the pretty small ones. Some people like to cut the big ones into slabs and grill them or bake them, but these ones were pretty small, and we're just not really that versed in the styles of eggplant that taste good, so maybe next year we won't grow as many of those.
And then with both the tomatoes and peppers, we noticed in the summertime when it gets really hot, the plants slow down production a lot. But we left them in the ground, and when fall came along and the temperature was cool, they picked back up. Of course, this is the indeterminate tomatoes, the ones that grow like vines and just keep producing. So we kind of had a second wind for those two.
Yeah, and I think in the future we'll take more consideration into the types of vegetables we actually like, and like what's useful. We don't want to grow too many tomatoes that are just a pain to harvest, like the currants we had. They're like these tiny little grape, even smaller than
grapes. They're red currant tomatoes, and they're anywhere between the size of a pea to, yeah, some of the bigger ones may be small grapes, but they are really small. They grow in clusters, but they just are prolific. Way more than we could.
Yeah. So
eat.
the eggplants and currants, we'll think about those for next year, but we might not do them.
Yeah. So with like the tomatoes and peppers, we grew several of each variety. So for the currants, for example, those tomatoes, we probably would only grow 1 or 2 plants instead of 6 of that specific variety.
And that kind of leads us to bush beans, which is next on our list. We kind of made a little wall of bush beans, having the seedlings grow right out of this little hill that we made. And
we're up a trellis.
Yeah.
So I had peas on that trellis in the springtime and then put beans there. It was my first time growing bush beans. But it turns out they don't need a trellis. They just kind of are like the description says, a bush.
Yeah.
So they were almost more like a ground cover than a trellising plant.
Yeah, so I think we may have learned our lesson on that. They don't grow the same as the peas.
The peas, the pole beans.
Yeah, all that stuff's a bit easier to harvest. Like when you have the trellis, it'll go up and you can be on one side or the other and you can pull the stuff off. But these bush ones, since we already had the trellis there, the trellis was kind of in our way of harvesting it. And you can't stand over it like you would a regular little bushy plant. So we basically had to like kind of get our bodies through the plant, look down in there to know if there was anything there. And I think they were actually there for several weeks, even a month, before we found out that how much fruit was actually on the bush.
Where the fruit was, because it wasn't, like I said, our first time, we didn't know what we were looking for, but they were really good. I mean, I would grow them again now that I know what to look for. They tasted good. We got a lot from them, and they're a winner. So
one of our favorites down here, since we moved to the south, is okra. Some of the okra we've grown here have been huge. Like last summer was our best experiment, where we had a huge area, like several rows of okra. Not full rows, but like a grid of okra. But this year we decided to do one really long row. I think we did a full 50-foot row.
Yeah.
But we didn't prune them.
We didn't thin them.
Right.
So we planted them like 6 inches apart and then left them like that. And we had almost 100%, what am I trying to say? Germination. So we planted the seeds and pretty much all of them sprouted 6 inches apart. I should have gone in and trimmed them down to 12 to 18 inches apart because they were pretty spindly. They didn't have room.
Mm-hmm. And then this year they were kind of in that more wet area of our garden instead of the taller area of the garden, or the higher elevation where they were last year. So we don't really know why we didn't get as many, but we barely got any okra this year.
They were also,
we had more plants.
It was also a different variety than we grew last year. Last year we grew jambalaya, and they were really fantastic. This year we grew spineless Clemson and burgundy. I wanted the burgundy because they're really pretty, and they taste really good too. But it could be, that the jambalaya just are a better yielding variety.
Mm-hmm. Let's talk a bit about your flowers. When I was out there trying to harvest peppers throughout the summer, I kind of lost track of some of the plants because they got absorbed into Angie's flowers.
So I had a lot of flower seedlings in the spring, and I just had this idea that I was going to put them into like empty spaces in the garden. Like we have our ground cloth and we burn holes in it, and if there was an empty hole, I put a flower in there, and they really liked it, but they got huge. They took up a lot of space.
Once the flowers got tall enough, they basically fell over, grew horizontally into the pepper row, and then went back up and completely absorbed some of our crops.
So they were cut and come again, zinnias, and they're great for pollinators, but the nature of that variety is that you cut them, and then they just, like, anytime you prune them back, they come back stronger, and I'm not going to do that again, just fill holes. They really need a dedicated part of the garden where they can take over without harming or invading
Yeah.
our crops.
Well, it was great for pollinators, though, so we should definitely have them around, but maybe not on top of the crop. So next on our list is the melons. I think we tried to grow more than we have in the past.
Yeah, and we were successful at that. We harvested several big, tasty watermelons, and so that was great. I hadn't ever done that before.
Yeah.
A few cantaloupe.
And we were surprised to see so many melons growing on the same vine. They just really liked where we put them. We kind of had a drier area this year up on top of some mulch.
Yeah.
It wasn't really planned, but since that space was open, we grew them. But some of the issues we had was, I guess during the wet season, kind of a lot of dirt would kind of cake up around the melon, and then we wouldn't pick up the melon to inspect it in time, and they would kind of rot from the bottom up.
Yeah, we had problems with them rotting, and but even with that, we still got a harvest off of them.
So this year we had an experimental garden. We had already filled up our main garden, so we had to start a new, I think maybe 30, 40 foot bed in one of our other yards. So we had the irrigation going on that. You can go check out our Three Sisters video if you're interested to see what we did there. But we were trying to grow popping corn. It was pretty successful as an experiment. We got a few full mason jars of popping corn.
But almost a gallon of popping corn.
But after we shucked the corn and started knocking the little kernels off, we found out that the full cob wasn't really intact as far as pollination goes. So we'll just have to think about that for the future, see if we can get better pollination rates on the cobs and give us a better yield.
So part of the Three Sisters was growing squash, and they just take up a lot of space. And the thing is that when we were doing research about it, they warned us to give them plenty of room, but even so, they were bigger, spread out more than we expected, and they were getting tangled up with the adjacent cucumbers that we had planted nearby.
Yeah, the goal of the squash with their big leaves was to kind of act as a ground cover and keep the weeds out of the Three Sisters garden. And I think it was pretty successful at that, but what we didn't account for is that it would also become the ground cover for any other gardens that we have nearby. So we might want to space out in the future one garden from the next.
Yeah, even more spacing, because both the cucumbers and the squash want to sprawl, and they sprawled into each other, and it just was a mess. So we need to give them even more space.
Yeah. So one thing I've heard from any gardeners and homesteaders is you have to think about pests. And anytime we think we solved one pest issue, we realize there's other pests that kind of move in their place. So one thing we've had to deal with this year that we didn't last year was deer coming into our yard. We've seen evidence of them, but we haven't actually seen them in the act. But they do leave their teeth marks behind on things like our melons, and we can see where they've pulled the beans off the vine.
Yeah, this is our third year on this property growing gardens. This is, of course, the biggest year yet, but it's also the first year that the deer have gotten comfortable enough to move into the garden and eat our crops. And we don't have fencing because it hadn't been an issue until now.
Yeah. So one thing we were pretty excited about this year was harvesting our own yellow squash, because we go through so much of that from the grocery store.
Squash.
But we were surprised by the amount of vine borers. They're actually a beetle that kind of goes through and eats the vine from the inside out, and it basically kills any production that vine will have past that point. I was able to kind of dissect some of the vines and get them out.
He performed surgery.
Yeah. So if the borer was at the very base, right by the ground, the plant's done. But if they're kind of closer towards the end, they'll only kill what's downstream from that vine. But basically, yeah, all of our yellow squash got devastated by that. We've noticed that there are some other varieties that aren't really as in danger of the devastation.
Yeah, because it was not just the yellow squash, but we planted several varieties of pumpkin and winter squash in the Three Sisters garden, and They got everything. The most resistant variety we grew was called Fairy Tale. Fairy Tale squash persevered. We've got about 6 healthy, good-looking pumpkins off of that.
So one thing I've done to try to attract some pollinators is to kind of let our acre field kind of overgrow. That does attract pollinators and keeps them around, but it also attracts rodents and bunnies. So we have these bunnies that kind of come out at night, dawn and dusk. They'll kind of come out and just start eating some of our crops. They ate a lot of our sweet potato leaves. It didn't seem to affect the production too much, but we also don't have a lot of experience growing sweet potatoes to know how much more we could have gotten.
Yeah, again, kind of like I said with the melons, it's like they ate a lot of leaves, but the vines kept growing, and we ended up getting a yield that I was happy with off of the sweet potatoes.
So one thing we love to see in our garden is ladybugs, because everyone knows they eat the aphids. So we were really happy to see how many wild ladybugs were coming into our cucumber patch. But then it turns out that they were not ladybugs. They were, what were they,
Cucumber beetles. So there were these elongated ladybugs with kind of what looked like ladybugs with the classic spots, but they had an oval-shaped body instead of a really round, half-spherical body the way that ladybugs have. And I just got suspicious and looked it up. I was like, long ladybug in the search engine, and it came up with these pictures of these cucumber beetles, and I caught it pretty early on. I would say early summer, late spring that I figured that out, and had to do some, try to catch them and dispose of them as much as I could. But they did eat a lot of, we would catch them clustering on the flowers and the fruit of cucumber and even melons.
Another pest we had was these worms that come from moths. They went into all of our brassicas and they were destroying, what did we have, like collard greens? Or
we grew collard greens. A lot of the cabbage, the way they grow their tight head, we're able to make it that they didn't get in there, but they got really into the broccoli, some of our broccoli.
And they blend in with the actual edible part of the broccoli and kind of scared us a bit when we were trying to eat it.
Yeah, I harvested some after a rainstorm, and I thought, oh, they're already rinsed. And I didn't rinse them extra, and they were in the florets on my plate. It was really gross. I did use some BT a few times to help with that, because that's just those cabbage moths, and they're just a common pest.
So while we're on the topic of animals, not necessarily pests, we've had some owls and hawks around, but one thing we've been pretty surprised to see was how many snakes there are. We've seen some pretty tiny ones in the mulch piles, but we have these big black snakes that show up. They live in our house, apparently. They know exactly where to go. We think they've been raised through the generations to know all the nooks and crannies in our house. When we try to catch them, they jump out of whatever trash can we put them in, and then they slither right into a specific hole in the side of the house and get into the insulation and nest in there. But we found them in the chicken coop a couple times, which is problematic because we don't want our birds to be stressed out too much. And we found out that all of our eggs disappear when those snakes are in the coop.
Yeah, they make themselves a little bed and breakfast in there if we don't deal with them. So we don't kill them. We load them up, we catch them, and when we put them in a garbage can, put the lid on, and then Ben takes them about a quarter mile to a creek.
So I'm definitely more comfortable now handling snakes than I was before, just because I've done it so much. I haven't been bit so far, so hopefully it stays that way. Let's talk a bit about succession cropping and what happened with that this year.
Okay. So succession cropping is when one crop is spent and then there's room for something else to put in. And, I had thought that I would be good about filling those spaces. And I did a few in the springtime, like when we harvested, I don't remember, maybe carrots, and then I put spinach in, and that was good. The spinach is a really short season. It only lasts about 6 weeks. But I don't know, come come the middle of summer, we really weren't doing that anymore. So we don't have a fall garden planted right now.
And we don't have a huge tractor to process our entire acre of land and keep everything, I guess, bountiful throughout the year. So we have to rely on just the smaller areas that we have processed and mulched and composted and covered for the winter. So it is kind of a waste if we let a plant get harvested and then we don't replace it and take advantage of the nutrients that we've built there in the soil. So back to that topic of the chickens, we talked about the snakes kind of scaring them and stuff, but what we didn't mention is we actually got some chickens. We adopted them. They were about egg-laying age, I believe.
Well, some of them were like 4 months old, so not quite egg-laying, and then one of them was probably about 7 months old, and she was laying eggs when we got her. We got them all at the same time from a neighbor.
Yeah, but the point of that was we didn't raise them from chicks, and they weren't as familiar with us as our other birds were. So they're pretty skittish to this day, and they still avoid us. So keep that in mind if you're adopting chickens. If you want them to be more like pets and be hands-on and be entertaining, you might want to raise them from a young age.
Yeah, the ones that we raise from day-olds are much more friendly.
Mm-hmm. So that's basically our problems that we faced. We'll do other videos about like how we're going to solve some of these things in the future, maybe what our goals are, how we're kind of aligning as we build things, and what we're trying to achieve. But let us know in the comment section if you want us to elaborate on any of these problems. Let us know if you faced any of these issues and how you solved them. Or if you have another YouTube channel in mind that answers all these questions that we've risen, let us know, and we'll check that out too, because we like to learn from YouTube.
Yeah, we do. Well, Happy New Year, everybody.
Yeah, happy holidays, Happy New Year, and just a quick surprise, we're engaged, and we're going to get married this year. Actually, next year.
Well,
this year's almost
2022,
over. Yeah.
we'll be married.
All right, catch you later.